Hello, my name is Byron Bridges. You just saw two videos in which one woman was explaining English while using ASL and another of a person typing on a teletypewriter and signing at the same time. Both of these are examples of bilingualism. Bilingualism is an interesting topic. People who are not deaf define this as being able to easily transition between two languages. Now, we'll compare that to how people in the deaf community define bilingualism.
Bilingualism means people have skills in ASL and English at the same time.
Bilingualism means that people know two different languages. It can potentially depend on where they work or live and the usage of two different languages there. It can also mean moving to a new place and learning an entirely new language. However, they still use their old first language at home, such as signing. Maybe they'll use different languages at both school and at home. And maybe their parents are married and know two different languages, such as German or French. Because of the language exposure, you eventually can learn these two different languages.
To me, bilingualism means two different languages. For example, I have skills in both Mexican Sign Language and in American Sign Language. I can easily switch back and forth between the two. Suppose I am in America, I would sign in ASL, and if I am in Mexico, I would use MSL. If my friends from Mexico came to visit me here in America, I would communicate in MSL, and if my friends from America came to visit my home in Mexico, I would communicate in ASL. Those are my two languages.
Bilingualism to me is knowing two different languages. I know how to sign or use ASL, and I know how to read and write in English. So I use ASL to socialize with other people, to discuss current political issues and other things as well. But I use English to read, for instance, the newspaper, or for my homework, I use written English. So I can work between these two languages with ease and proficiency.
To me, bilingualism means being able to understand two different languages, such as ASL and English. I am a sign language interpreter, so I can hear spoken English and communicate the same message in ASL instantly, just like I can see sign language and turn that into spoken English.
It is interesting to see how the deaf community describes bilingualism as knowing ASL and English, whereas people who aren't deaf describe it as knowing English as well as other languages, such as Spanish and French. Both groups agree that being bilingual means being able to transition between different languages. There seems to be similarities between the two perspectives. Now we will see how these groups of people became bilingual.
First, I was born deaf into a hearing family. From when I was born until I was about 17, I had English skills, but no signing skills. I was able to write sentences and speak in English. When I entered college around the age of 17, I was immersed into the deaf world. They have signing. I was stunned. It was amazing. In 10 years, ASL became important because I now have an identity, and I realize that I have skills in both English and signing. It's nice. I learned Italian Sign Language and Quebec Sign Language, which are different. It's nice to know not one, but 2, 3, 4 different languages.
To me, bilingualism means, for example, growing up in Australia, the language used is Auslan. And deaf people in Australia use Auslan Sign Language. I have deaf parents and there are deaf families all over Australia. Growing up, I used and saw a lot of Auslan Sign Language, but had no knowledge of English. However, I remember learning how the two languages transition. I knew when I wanted something, my mom would tell me, "Go ahead, yes." Later on, I went to my aunt's house and she took the time to teach me a different language. I wanted an apple, so I asked my aunt if I could have it, and my aunt fingerspelled yes. I was puzzled, asking, yes, what does that mean? Yes means yes. I looked at her, so I can have the apple? Yes, yes. Moving forward, I grabbed the apple. Are you sure? She emphasized yes, meaning yes, and yes means yes. I ate the apple and started to understand. Since then, and going to school, I learned more English and how to transition between the two languages and understand it. Arriving to America, there is a different sign language called ASL, which I am learning. Therefore, I have learned 3 languages.
So how I learned 2 languages? Well, I was raised by 2 deaf parents, and I grew up learning ASL as my primary language. I'd wave my little hands around signing. So when it was time for me to go to school, I was very excited to see other students just like me. So I remember I was holding my parents' hand as we walked up to the classroom, and the teacher came up to us and said hi, but they were signing and talking at the same time. So I was watching skeptically and noticed that her signing was absolutely horrible, but I still understood. I looked around at the other students and saw that all of the other children were talking and signing wildly. They looked like animals. It shocked me. So later on, my teacher approached me and signed very methodically, trying to teach me English. But understand, I can't really write word for word exactly what I sign, being they're 2 different languages. I needed to follow along with what my supervisor was writing on the board, even though it looked very different than what I was used to. So anyways, I would go back home and proudly show my family all the new signs that I learned at school that day. But they would be shocked and say that it's all wrong, and all the signs that I was showing them were not natural ASL. So they would correct me, and I would make the appropriate changes at home. But then when I was back at school, I would change back to the sign language there and communicate just like everyone else.
I grew up in Mexico using Mexican Sign Language, and when I was 8 years old, I moved to America. I went to a deaf residential school, and when I would fingerspell to the teacher, I would use an enye. The teacher would tell me that an enye is only used in Mexico. Here, we use the letter N. And that is when I understood that they were 2 separate languages.
I remember learning my first language, ASL. I remember this because I didn't have a language until I was around 3 years old. My parents would try to use their language with me, but I didn't understand what they were saying. I remember the first time I understood language. I was around 3 years old when a deaf couple told me that they were deaf like me. They began to teach me how to sign, and I caught right on. I was so fascinated with signing. I learned a variety of different things, and soon I was proficient in using ASL. When I was around 4 years old, I went to a deaf program, and that was where I learned my second language, English. I learned through pictures, books, and by focusing on English words. I understood what the alphabet looked like, and that it was a part of English. I would still use ASL, though, with my teachers or when I was playing outside with other kids. Today, I can go between these 2 languages with proficiency.
I grew up non-deaf and learned English as my first language. I learned to speak and understand English, but when I was around 18 or 19, I saw a sign language course and I was intrigued. So I took the class and my fluency started off slow and I understood only a little bit. Later on, I started to take more courses and my fluency progressed. About 2 or 3 years ago, I became a certified interpreter and I was still learning. Now I am very fluent in ASL.
So how do deaf people and people who aren't deaf become bilingual? People who are not deaf become bilingual by listening to different languages, whereas deaf people acquire different languages visually. The experiences between these 2 groups of people are different. Now, let's look at how they use bilingualism in their everyday lives.
Every day I use bilingualism. Every morning, I read the newspaper in English, and I discuss what I read with my roommate in ASL. It's different things like what's been happening. In English class, I read and write English and normally discuss in ASL, but don't use English sentences. I use both English and ASL every day.
There are two languages I use every day. For example, I grew up in Australia, and deaf people there use ASL Sign Language and teletypewriter. When using the teletypewriter, I communicate typing in English, and the message goes to whomever I'm communicating with who can read and write in English. Deaf people in Australia use ASL and transition between the two with reading, writing, and the newspaper. Suppose in America, I learn and become skilled in the three languages and how to transition between ASL and English, while reading, writing, and the newspaper in English. If a friend from Australia were to come to America, I would communicate using Australian Sign Language and quote-unquote interpret so they can understand. Also, if they want to talk to an American deaf person, I would use American Sign Language with the American and interpret for my friend using ASL Sign Language. Likewise, interpreting for the American, going back and forth, proficiently using both languages.
I use bilingualism every day. For example, when my friend and I are watching television, I would be reading the closed captioning that appears at the bottom of the screen, and I would be able to understand the English captions with no problem. But sometimes my friend wouldn't understand what was happening with the captions. They would get lost and embarrassed. They would ask me to explain what the captions meant, and I would explain them to him using American Sign Language while reading and understanding the English captions at the same time. So I experience both of these languages.
Yes, I use two languages every single day. For example, when I'm in class and the teacher hands out assignments, which are written in English, some things may be confusing to us. So all of us students get together in a group and discuss the assignment using ASL until we fully understand. Then we go back to the computers and switch back into English for the assignment.
I use bilingualism every day by using both English and ASL. For instance, sometimes I will go to a restaurant with my friend. We will read from the menu by using English and discuss what we might be having to eat in ASL. Once we've decided, I tell our server what I would like to eat by pointing at the menu. If my server doesn't understand, then I will write it down in English.
How do I use both languages? A while back, I was teaching English to deaf students. I would write English sentences on the board, and if the students were confused by anything, I would explain it in ASL, another language that they were familiar with, and that would help them understand both languages. Their skills began to improve in both English and in ASL.
Deaf people and people who are not deaf use language differently. People who are not deaf can transition between languages while they are speaking, talking on the phone, and other ways. Deaf people use a teletypewriter by taking ASL and typing it into English. A sentence in English looks different compared to how it would look in ASL. As you can see, these two groups of people use language in different ways, but they have similar perspectives of what it means to be bilingual. Next, we will see examples of how deaf people who are bilingual sign in their native language. This is truly fascinating. I hope you learned from the people in the video about bilingualism and that language can be used in different ways. The goal of this video was to teach people what it means when you know more than one language, and to encourage people to learn more languages. Some people are worried about their deaf children acquiring language, but this video proves that deaf people can be bilingual or even trilingual. I hope to encourage more parents with deaf children to study language and support the movement of bilingualism. Thank you.